It's been a long and intense road to get here, but I've finally gone over the entirety of Interview with the Vampire book. We've reviewed Interview with the Vampire movie, and we're wrapping it up by looking at Interview with the Vampire, the TV show series. So this video specifically, we're going to go over Interview with the Vampire episode 1 and 2. I think managing expectations when you go into a TV show or a movie is very important, and it has a big impact on how you feel about that thing coming out of it. I already know they made a lot of big changes to Interview with a Vampire to suit this TV show adaptation. There's a limitation of what you can show on TV or how you can film certain things now that there wasn't even in 1994 when they did Interview with a Vampire, the movie. So I'm not expecting to see Claudia as like a young child. I'm hoping that we get a little bit more on like the religious, philosophical elements we see in Interview with a Vampire. I'm hoping to see a little bit more maybe about mental health and welfare and where that intersects both with vampirism and the supernatural. And of course, I'm looking first to really like build up this gay allegory, gay story that we have first between Louis and Lestat, later between Louis and Armand, and possibly even some kind of chemistry between Louis and David. With that said, all of the vampires in Anne Rice's books are monstrous. Their relationships end up being violent, bad, abusive in some kind of way, shape, or form. So I'm not necessarily looking for a love story, but I'm looking for like that passion and like those big highs. Incredible love, fascination, obsession, grand, sweeping romance. And then I'm looking for it to like take sharp, violent, unexpected terms and like these incredible power dynamics, a level of cruelty, cunning, and meanness that you could only really expect to see in a relationship that's been long-standing. When I'm looking at these relationships, I am looking at them as vampire relationships outside the lens of a human dynamic in a relationship. So like I'm not looking for vampires to model healthy relationships. In fact, what might be a healthy or acceptable relationship for vampires would never fly for a human, and that's fine. Asking immoral creatures of the night to do that is asking for trouble. And I'm looking at Interview with a Vampire kind of as like a prestige show like Dexter or that Hannibal show that came out or Breaking Bad. The characters here are interesting and people we want to watch, but not people that we necessarily like or would ever want to model our lives after. And I am okay with things being problematic as long as we're intensely exploring and utilizing those problematic elements to their fullest. So now that we've got all that out of the way, let's dive into some thoughts I have on episode 1 and 2, starting with my take on those characters. So looking at David, I'm seeing him as a character who is in name only. David from the book was young, inexperienced, kind of nervous, not very challenging, and like very much in awe, possibly even a little envious of Louis and his vampiric lifestyle. And this new David we're meeting is old, grouchy, combative, not at all impressed or even like in awe of in any way the vampires. Young David wanted to become a vampire by the time he finished his interview, and this older David supposedly did the first interview and is here in a second interview when he finds out that there might be a larger cabal of vampires that want to do a great conversion. He says no one would want to do that. So it's like a very different take than his book counterpart. Possibly a different take than young David in the show. We don't really know too much about that. They bring back Louis's brother for this version of Interview with a Vampire. His name's Paul. And I don't like how they depict him for this. I think it would have been better if they just left him out entirely. In the book Interview with a Vampire, Paul is like a very important element in Louis's life. He seeks solace and understanding. He deeply respects his brother, loves him, sort of takes care of him, makes sure he has everything he needs, but also goes to him for like advice, comfort, a companionship he's not really getting from the rest of the world, maybe like a certain level of acceptance he just doesn't feel he's getting. This Paul is so clearly troubled and competitive and aggressive, even though Louis says that Paul's no burden and that he relies on Paul a lot and has a close relationship with him. We don't really see that except right before Paul kills himself. So it's very hard to believe that that ever happened. I suppose we could use Paul in that way in flashbacks in the future, and I might have to change my first impression. But as it stands right now, there's a lot of contradictions between what Lewis says is happening versus what we're actually seeing on screen. Obviously, in a visual medium, I care more about what I'm seeing than what Lewis is saying. In the book, it really is an open question about whether or not Paul is mentally ill or has some kind of religious vision or prophecy or magical something or other. The Vampire Chronicle world as a whole, the devil, God, saints, all these things are real and exist. So it's not out of the realm that Paul might actually be getting visions. One of the reasons that I still hold this as a possibility is because in the book, when Paul confronts Lewis, he's asking for all of Lewis's money that he can go do his trip or whatever. And if Lewis had actually given him all of his money, then Lestat wouldn't have picked Lewis, which means Lewis would never have become a vampire or a damned being in a tortured existence. So that could be like his chance to be saved that he passed up on. And I just think like the connection between that, where Lewis is feeling this guilt in this book minimally for potentially making his brother so upset he had this accident and died, possibly Lewis like having missed his chance to be saved too by just believing his brother, something he's fixated on and grappling with and has so many like little connections and points. Like I keep coming back to it and wondering about it myself. And Paul's death here in the show, the fact that he's clearly mentally ill, it makes Paul frustrating. I think the portrayal of mental illness here is kind of stereotypical and bad. I'm not an expert on it, so maybe this is accurate, I don't know, but it looks to me like a mishmash of stereotypes. Like they couldn't exactly like pick any one thing that Paul might have and actually portray it in kind of an accurate and meaningful way. So that's kind of like frustrating and annoying too, especially in a show that's already kind of been picked apart for like choosing diverse representation without being thoughtful about it. Overall, I'd have to say even though Paul has more individual elements that are like his book counterpart, his ultimate portrayal and purpose in this show is also a strong in name only. And Lewis is super different from his original book counterpart as well. He's a being that's shown to have like a lot of agency and often proactive instead of reactive when he does take that personal agency and start influencing and changing things. The whole reason he even wants to do this second interview and do the book this time around is because he's trying to like affect the world and stop these plotting vampires, which is not a thing Book Lewis would do. And besides having agency, being proactive, he's also pretty angry and impulsive, especially in our 1910 rendition when he's human slash a young vampire. But even as the like more mature Lewis who's talking to David, who's called David to do this interview, a lot of times he's like a little impetuous and like a little off the cuff in his responses for David in a way that is not at all like the vampire in the book, who often stops and thinks when David asks him questions, uses his words very carefully and like hand plucks them out. And I think this decision to change Lewis's character in this way is very interesting because it reminds me of how Lestat is described in the book. Incredibly impulsive. He seems to be angry and vicious and cruel all the time. One thing that is similar though is in the book, Lewis kind of felt out of place in his own life. Even before he became a vampire, Lewis in this TV show also feels like he's out of place. They've taken this a little bit further by making him like a black man in the 1910s, prejudice that's physically keeping him out of certain spaces. But we see this even in his family life. Overall, in episode 1, I liked this new Lewis a lot and was interested in doing some more comparison and contrasting and getting to know him and seeing what his journey would look like into vampirism. My problem shows up in episode 2, where it seems like the show decided that this new TV Lewis would do the same vampiric journey that Book Lewis doesn't work with new Lewis's character. Book Lewis is disgusted by killing. He's horrified just watching Lestat kill somebody. He even says like, hey, I don't want to be turned because that was too much. And Lestat was like, sucks to be you, it's too late, and drains him there on the steps. TV show Lewis watches Lestat brutally murder a priest he's been going to church with, confessing with, spending a lot of time with because he's very close to Paul. And Lewis is like,
yeah, screw it, I'm just gonna start killing people.
He doesn't seem upset about their body disposal, their loss. But somehow when he does his first kill and it's like this rando stranger, he tells David he was upset, but we don't actually see him being that upset in the show. The closest he comes to it is like a panic after they roll the salesman up in the rug and wanting to go home. But that seems more like he's just overwhelmed with the situation as a whole. Like he's realizing that his brother is dead, that he's just made a decision he can't come back from. The only person he can really rely on now is Lestat. And it's just a lot of things together at once. But I don't think it's the killing that broke him. He starts living like this double life as a vampire slash mortal man. And he seems actually enjoy killing. Like he really likes the power he had over that one racist inspector where he could just go out and kill him because he was a rude, ignorant butthead. We get a casual mention that he's been skipping meals, but compare that. Lewis in the book going only animals for 4 years. Like those two are not at all congruent. One of them seems like a pretty successful vampire with an occasional qualm. And the other one is a vampire that refuses to drink human blood. Vastly different. I would say that this TV show, Louis and Lestat, appear to be on the same page. There's no conflict for TV show Louis and Lestat to have. There's no hesitation there. Louis and Lestat's relationship to this point, it looks to me like Lestat really adores Louis. He has a couple like red flag moments where it's like, oh, that's not great. But mostly he seems to just like want to be near and be willing to go along with things that Louis wants to do, even if he doesn't want to do them. Even if this version of Louis had decided he was going to drink only animal blood, I feel like Lestat would poke fun at him a little bit here and there, but would more or less be like,
you and your weird quirks. Come on now, let's go to the theater.
So when they're trying to show this conflict, and when we're getting the scene from the book where this conflict came to the head, don't understand. Such a drastic, strange tonal shift that doesn't make sense to me in context of everything else I've witnessed. Feels like Lewis's new personality and new circumstances and everything that they gave him is at odds with the plot they decided to tell. And I would have really just rather they'd run with the new character they made and taken this in a slightly different direction. Like, it's fine that Louis and Lestat have a better relationship. It's fine that they're happy and they're in love, and that's what we're depicting like the good years to be. But let's just roll with that and keep going. Don't try to shoehorn this breaking point in that no longer makes any sense with the new character that Louis is. I'm moving into Lestat. His character is a little bit harder to pin down because if we're looking at the totality of the Vampire Chronicles, Lestat's character changes quite a bit from Interview with the Vampire to later installments, and it does feel a little bit like they picked and choose different little pieces, cobbled them together in a way that is the least coherent I've ever seen Lestat be on screen. In this version of Lestat, he is a couple hundred years old instead of a younger vampire. He is incredibly wealthy and therefore doesn't need Louis for anything, so like that draining element of the vampire isn't happening in that way. But it also like adds this complicated element to their relationship. When Louis was the rich one and Lestat was the poor one, there was like this power pull here that actually elevated Louis. But now Lestat is the rich one and Louis is the poorer one. And Lestat is white and European and privileged, and Louis is black and being shunned from society. The scale is just so tippy-toppy. And then on top of that, Lestat is a vampire and has all these vampiric abilities that Louis doesn't have. Even when Louis becomes a vampire, half-step levels back up, Lestat still knows everything and can teach it to him as he pleases. And that makes for an unhealthy relationship, but optically it also, it's just not great on screen watching like a white man kind of be able to lord everything over a black man. And it doesn't like come together when they become vampires either. Now they're like lovers, and that also feels like an unequal playing ground because Lestat, fine with his sexuality and out there and open and very comfortable, and Louis is still struggling. And the way Lestat has like all these powers where he can like stop time, slow time down, literally force people to do things that he wants them to do, it does also make me wonder, the seduction period between Louis and Lestat, was Louis's brain in any way, shape, or form manipulated? It seems like at their first meeting where he's stuck at the table and he doesn't want to be there, Lestat might be keeping him there forcefully. Is that the only time it happened? Or like is some of the preternatural charm that Lestat has actually just forcing people to like him. Talking about Lestat's character, he says he only kills people who deserve it, which if we're looking at the vampire Lestat that's right from that book, explaining that he only kills murderers and rapists and people who have done bad things. And here, where we watch him murder two priests, and we had watched him like murder that lamp guy in the last episode, and it's like,
okay, so what do those people do?
do those people just deserve to die because they're like peasants? That just makes you so classist and so gross and disgusting. I just wish that line didn't exist, and I kind of wish we'd gotten with a Lestat that just enjoys killing instead of a Lestat who like joyfully kills murderers. It would have been preferable for them to leave Lestat as he was in the original Interview with the Vampire book. Like if he had been a young, kind of impulsive, badly off vampire, maybe he gets off the boat, is intrigued by Louis, gets a job working for him, and the two of them like kind of build a relationship. It could even get to be during their like month of like courting or whatever. Louis realizes he can use Lestat as like the white face for his business interests, and he like kind of trains Lestat on like the right kind of mannerisms and ways to go into things and what to say and how to say, and then he puts him in the boardroom, and that's how he gets like his business interests in the door, and they have like this dynamic partnership that way. I think that would have been really interesting and would have been a great way to take this, and a couple of scenes I wanted to talk about. Originally, the David-Louis interaction was interesting, and I thought that this being the second interview had potential, especially when they called out that in the first interview, David really didn't act as an interviewer. He didn't challenge anything, he didn't ask follow-up questions, he didn't do research and come back with different facts to Louis. All of this is true about the first book and is a thing that I thought of but didn't say anything about. David as an interviewer is a literary device in that book, and he interrupts every now and then to get like a little bit more detail Lewis probably wouldn't have naturally given us, and sometimes he interrupts so that we can change flow. All of the third and the fourth act happens without David interrupting. The flow and the pacing of that doesn't do for interruptions. So like pointing out how unrealistic the interview is when it's doing everything it's supposed to be doing in a literary function just seems stupid to me. Here I was like,
David's gonna be way more involved in this version.
But he's not. He doesn't do challenges, he doesn't bring up like history debunking moments, doesn't seem to question anything. Every now and then he comes out and he's like,
well, did you eat the baby?
but Lois was gonna tell him that anyways. It's just annoying instead of good storytelling. And also it creates this device where Lewis can tell us things and we can never see them on screen. For example, where he tells us that Paul means a lot to him and we never really see that moment. Or when he keeps telling us that Lestat had a way about, when it would have just been better to see Lestat's way about him. Or when he tells us that he's a bad vampire, but the only thing we see on screen is him being a pretty dope vampire. It feels like the interview portion is there to keep us on book plot track, even though everything we've built doesn't really fit into this plot. Also, David over here revokes his gay sexuality. He could have been bisexual, pansexual, gay, and that would have all been in line with his book counterpart and with what we know about him in the first interview. And also it would have given him a point to relate to Lewis about, because the same way Lewis wasn't ready to be out in 1910, David wasn't ready to be out back in 1984, and they could have like related about their journey and progression and like had an actual honest to goodness moment. And instead David gets mad and says that it was all about drugs and that he is hardcore straight, and I just didn't understand why that decision was made. Very turned off like to the whole situation and giving everything going on like a lot less grace than I was originally coming into this with. I do think the way they showed Paul's suicide was particularly interesting. That whole moment was like the first little glimmer of hope that Paul might actually be a worthwhile character. Like I really enjoyed his presence at their sister's wedding, the dancing. It felt like he was actually connecting both with his sister and his brother. And when him and Louis are climbing to see the sunrise together, talk about the wedding and the future, very charming and enjoyable. And there's this light moment where it was like,
so here's the Paul that Lewis has been talking to us about.
the tragedy symbolicity of that hit me as incredibly profound and difficult. And also the way the mother blames him for Paul's death. That felt true to the book, along with the way the funeral was portrayed, and all of those elements I think are like meshing in a very good way. Kind of relieved that we got Paul out of this narrative because he was acting very stereotypically mentally ill in a way that I don't think is a good portrayal, and I just wanted that portrayal to end. The church turning was interesting to me because it was reminiscent of a scene much later in the books after Claudia puts her first kill attempt on Lestat and Louis wanders into the church and confesses to the priest, and then the priest yells at him and he kills the priest. That scene and him going in to confess, ask for help as a human, and Lestat getting mad and killing the priest is very similar. Louis is not quite at the point where he could kill a priest, especially a priest that he knows and is friendly with. So it makes sense for Lestat to come in with that rage and that vampirism and that angry atheism kind of thing, and to kill both these priests and use that as his sales pitch to get Louis to join him. Even though the church scene is incredibly impractical, I really enjoy it. And what I mean by impractical is how they handle the church after they've made that huge bloody mess in it. Like, they roll the two priest bodies up and take them to the graveyard. Like, that solves anything. There's blood all over that church. I really expected the next scene to be of them burning the church down. I found Louis's first kill to be incredibly underwhelming as a scene, and emoting wise just not there. I really don't think it was given the emphasis it needed based off of the emphasis it had on the book, especially because it looks like they want to follow the book plot even though they don't have the right character personalities to do that anymore. And then Lestat as a mentor is further confusing to me. In the book, he withholds a ton of information from Louis, and that's like one of the major ways Lestat has more power than Louis. I guess it makes sense that he's like freer with information because he loves Louis and wants him like to join him in this life and really embrace it and be able to do all the things. But there are key moments where Lestat is casually cruel or flippant that just feel really odd. Like, you would think some guy who wants to be Louis's lover and really cares about him would be significantly more caring with Louis as his body is dying and he's going through this semi-terrifying transformation. And he's not, which is book accurate but doesn't make sense with the character as established. And you would think that he would want to keep Louis from harm, so he might tell him before he goes outside that he would burn up in the sun, figuratively and literally trapped with Lestat. For Louis's part, when the coffin scene happens, they tried to turn that into like a peaceful, loving, kind scenario because this is supposed to be like a gay romance now. And I don't think it works. It's not book accurate, but it also doesn't work because Louis has just been like super badly burnt by the sun, which is a thing that Lestat just like casually let happen. And now he's supposed to like snuggle up and take comfort in Lestat? I don't think so. And then lastly, I want to talk about the close of episode 2 where they kill the opera singer and Louis is super conflicted about it. Like, that doesn't make any sense to me based off of what we've seen of this new Louis. It's like harkening back to a book version of Louis that doesn't exist in the TV show. 100% don't know why this version of Louis is upset about the opera singer. And because I don't understand and can't relate, that makes me nervous about the story going forward. Like, I feel like they've created this situation where there's going to be a significant conflict between characters they've created and the journey they're supposed to go on, and the two of them just don't match, and we're gonna get like this pull back and forth. I mean, we're gonna find out, I guess, in episode 3, which I'll be watching shortly, but I really loved episode 1. I thought that was atmospheric and interesting and introducing new things that I thought would be worth exploring. And then we go into episode 2 and there are shining individual elements, but they don't come together in a cohesive way. It's been really interesting watching this new adaptation to Interview with a Vampire. It's got me thinking about whether or not this TV show is actually an adaptation or if it's just like loosely based on Anne Rice's work. Doesn't even feel like they've got the rules of the vampirism or any of the symbolic elements down right. And I feel like if you changed the names of the vampires and you got rid of the interview element, which right now isn't doing any good work for you anyways, you'd have an entirely different story that could have been written by an entirely different author. But maybe I'll see more connections between the TV show and the series as we get further into the episodes. I'm kind of concerned. But talk to me. What did you think about Interview with a Vampire, the TV show? Is it something you'd be interested in watching? Is it something you enjoyed? Tell me in those comments down below. And as always, keep reading. Bye!